Hello, you're listening to Democracy Watch, the News Collective's weekly news report, bringing you alternative and undercovered current affairs from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. My name is Alex DeBoer. It's Thursday, March 29th at 5:02 p.m. We're broadcasting from UBC's Vancouver campus on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. On today's show, we're going to hear an audio doc that I made last week on the relationship between city staff and city councillors. And after that, the News Collective has a piece produced by Guillermo Rosales, which is a public policy perspective on vacancy control and BC's history of rent control. So that's all coming up today. So first of all, we're going to start, as I said, with this audio documentary I made on the relationship between city staff and city councillors. To give a bit of context to that, what incentivized me to make this piece was a couple of incidents in City Hall that happened mid to early March, even late February, actually. So there were a couple situations. One was that city staff were directed to report back on a motion that passed in December, and they were instructed, one of the main parts of this motion that Jean Swanson authored was to implement vacancy control. Vacancy control is when a unit of housing is tied to the tenant, not or when the rent is tied to the unit, not the tenant. So when someone moves out, they can't just jack up the rent. So in this motion, this December motion that passed, Jean Swanson asked for vacancy control, asked for the city council to lobby the provincial government for vacancy control, and staff were instructed to look into that. So basically, I think it was Kennedy Stewart said he amended the motion so that instead of council right away lobbying the provincial government, instead staff would look into it and do some research and come back and report to council. So they came back and reported on that motion, but they didn't mention vacancy control. So it was interesting to wonder whether that was simply, conversations happening behind closed doors, councillors and staff maybe working it out of public earshot, or if it was them just not doing it. There was also another situation that was reported in the Georgia Strait where city manager Sadhu Johnston said that city council were causing a lot of problems, and he was referring to certain councillors, I think probably Jean Swanson, Colleen Hardwick, maybe Pete Fry, a few councillors who have been openly very critical of the Rental 100 program the city has, which is the program that incentivizes the building of rental housing. And this program has been in place, I think it's for about a decade now. And under the previous council, a lot of applications to build housing were put forward under this program. So there's all these development applications ready to be approved at city council that started going down the pipeline years ago. And so when councillors now are like, well, we don't actually like the program under which these applications pass through, there's a bit of tension around, whether councillors can do that, if they can just, stop a housing application development from being built because they want to. Legally, they can. But anyway, Sadhu Johnston saw this as creating a lot of problems. And so I sort of explore all these things in this documentary. So enough of me talking. Let's take a listen. This piece is called We Run the City. Enjoy.
Thank you very much for following up on that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to staff for the presentation. It was really thorough.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
First of all, I want to thank you. I didn't do that before I asked my question, so thank you very much. I know.
Also thought I'd start off today by thanking the staff for their great work. We've been interacting now since elected and sworn in on November 5th, and the competence and excellence of the staff continues to amaze me. So please keep up the good work. Can we have the roll call, please?
Mayor Stewart in the chair, Councillor Carr.
TR's News Collective.
Councillor DeGenova, not in the chamber.
At large.
Councillor Fry.
Is that too
Councillor
short?
Swanson.
No.
Councillor Hardwick.
At large.
Councillor Lee.
From CITR's News Collective.
Councillor Boyle.
Lola, why don't you try it?
Sick.
Councillor Blair.
You're listening to At Large from the News Collective at CITR.
City staff are often invisible to the public, except for the audible thank yous from councillors during public hearings and meetings. But the reality is, staff play a huge role in keeping the city running smoothly. And lately, staff have been getting more of a media spotlight. On March 6th, the Georgia Straight reported that City Manager Sadhu Johnston said councillors were causing, and I quote, a lot of problems, referring to some councillors' resistance to projects seeking approval under the city's Rental 100 program. In an opinion piece in The Straight, published a couple days later, activists Neil Vokey and Sarah Sagai of the Vancouver Tenants Union also noted that although city staff were specifically instructed to look into the viability of vacancy control in connection with a December motion titled Protecting Tenants from Rent Evictions and Aggressive Buyouts, staff didn't even mention vacancy control in the report they presented to council on February 27th. The question has been raised, exactly what is the relationship between city staff and council? How much power does city staff have? Can they ignore council directives? And how much, if any, bias guides them when advising council?
I'm going to quote Yes Minister, which I'll have to tell you about if you're not familiar with it. It was a BBC series back in the 80s between a minister and his deputy.
How's your new minister, Humphrey?
Learning the rules very quickly for a new boy. How's your new cabinet?
No problem. Can hardly tell the difference from the last one.
Very funny, very sharp, a little exaggerated. You know, basically the storyline was the deputy controlled the minister, and he had a lot of subtle ways of doing it.
That's Gordon Price. Gordon was an NPA city councillor from 1986 to 2002. He brings up the example of the BBC series Yes Minister to illustrate how powerful government staff can be behind the scenes. From his nearly 2 decades on city council, Gordon understands the relationship between city staff and council.
Structurally, it's pretty straightforward. Council develops policy and staff implements, but there is in the middle this responsibility to, on one hand, advise the current council and what you know its mandate is. And then there's also the job to be nonpartisan in every sense, not just politically, but to give as broad a range of options based upon what the mandate of council was and what the past policies were, and sure, to some degree, what the staff think council should be thinking about.
So staff are meant to be impartial, to implement policy and advise council based on city policies that are in place, though this hasn't always been the case.
There was a real problem with municipal corruption throughout North America in the 1920s.
That's Globe and Mail reporter and Vancouver city politics expert, Frances Beulah.
I mean, if somebody from one political party got elected in a city, I mean, all of their friends would then get hired at the city down to, you know, like pothole fillers and all the rest of it, and the other person's crew would be out, and then, you know, it would all shift. But there were a lot of complaints about how corrupt those city governments were, and most of North American cities moved to a system that we call a weak mayor, strong city manager system, where politicians would come and go, and they didn't have huge numbers of powers, and the bureaucracy, which was professional, stayed, and that would ensure stability and continuity for the city. And
so while city staff are supposed to be impartial, they're also supposed to be powerful. Our city councils change, but the cogs of bureaucracy need to keep turning without fail. Yet here in Vancouver, with our weak mayor, strong city manager system, are city staff consistently impartial?
Great. So we are now moving on to item 1, presentation, and I see Mr. Garrison ready to present to us.
On February 27th, city staff presented a report to council. They had been specifically instructed to look into the viability of vacancy control in connection with a motion that passed in December, which was Motion B10, titled Protecting Tenants from Rent Evictions and Aggressive Buyouts.
This is the first, really, of a series of reports you're going to be getting back on this issue over the coming months.
However, in their presentation, any mention of vacancy control and its viability were notably absent. I asked Gordon whether he thought this was a symptom of city staff bias.
If on something like vacancy control, you know that there's going to be a lot of players here, that there's going to be a lot of different things to consider. I don't know, because, hey, I'm not sitting around that table, but I can think of 2 or 3 things that might have happened. Might have talked to Councillor Swanson.
So Gordon thinks a few things are possible in this case, and that staff and city council likely talked about the viability of vacancy control out of public earshot. And there's also the possibility that city staff will comment on vacancy control in a later report, as Senior City Planner Dan Garrison seems to have suggested at the beginning of his presentation. But let's look at another recent example of perceived staff bias.
Which is item 1. We have 7 items on unfinished business. The first one would be rezoning on West 4th Avenue. So we're going to begin
on February 27th, City Manager Sadhu Johnston said council was causing, and I quote, a lot of problems. He was commenting on resistance from a few councillors to pass Rental 100 projects that had been submitted under the previous council. His words were reported in the Georgia Straight on March 6th. To better understand Sadhu's criticism, let's look at a specific example.
My point of information was regarding the legal questions, and I really thank the city manager. I'm sorry to put him in that position, but I couldn't make this decision without having that, so I was hoping that he might be able to.
You conferred with, thanks very much. So over to City Manager, thank you.
In the case of a rental project located at 1906 West 4th Avenue, Councillor Swanson tried to add an amendment imposing vacancy control on the development, and Councillor DeGenova asked the city manager if that would put the city in any legal trouble.
Staff have grave concerns with this direction. With that said, legally, council is full authority to implement the changes that have been adopted by council. We would...
So City Manager Sadhu Johnston said council could legally impose vacancy control onto this development, but by doing so, they would render the project unviable. This determination of unviability is based on projected lost profits the developer would suffer if vacancy control were forced on them. And this is where we find potential for bias. Couldn't what makes a project profitable be reasonably considered a matter of opinion? For example, if I sell a house for $100,000 and make $10,000 in profit, I might consider that sale profitable, but someone else might not. And the idea that councillors are, as Sadhu Johnston said, causing a lot of problems also seems subjective. I asked Gordon if in this case, Sadhu was advising with bias.
What he was saying, although he didn't quite say it, was you're changing the rules of the game. This project has already gone through a lot of hoops, and now you're going to do something that changes the conditions on which all the assumptions were made. Again, you're entitled to do that. But if you do, every other developer or every other really participant in processes that the city has established are basically going to say, WTF, wait a minute. You mean I can go through all of this and then at the last moment, oh, there's the rug up, and we're either back to the beginning or, hey, I'm walking.
Right.
So this is a classic case of the staff protecting them from themselves.
Yes, and that I think you're absolutely right. He was saying, this is a bad idea because you're changing the rules of the game. But by saying that as well, like if we're talking about sort of subjectivity and bias, couldn't Sadhu have just as easily said, yes, by adding vacancy control, you are changing the rules of the game and it might stop the project from proceeding, but this might be what's necessary to achieve real affordability? Like, couldn't he have said something like that?
Yeah, they could have done that. But then a very interesting question here. Oh, this is a major change in policy, and you're going to do that by amendment?
So it would have disrupted the status quo, but Sadhu could have noted alternatives to Rental 100. He could have challenged the notion that building more expensive rental stock will make things easier for renters. He could have, but he didn't. And he didn't because he was advising to keep things working the way they always do at City Hall. The logic is, we need developers to build housing, and so we need to keep them happy.
I think certainly everybody understands that with the cutbacks in public housing from CMHC and from federal governments dating back to the Mulroney era and then through to Harper and Chrétien and others, planners are smart. They understand that the money has to come from somewhere, and because there's less money from the federal government in terms of who puts the buildings on the ground, who puts the money forward for the development, it really is the private market.
That's Tom Hutton. Tom worked in the development office of the finance division at City Hall from 1978 to 1991. Now he teaches.
I'm a professor of urban studies and city planning at the School of Community and Regional Planning and the faculty of applied science at UBC.
Tom says in response to government not building enough housing, city planners tend to seek funding from an alternative option, private developers. And he says this, working within the system logic, is part of planning schools. I don't know if this is too sweeping of a question, but are city planners taught to be market-oriented in terms of finding solutions to...
Yeah.
They are?
I think I wouldn't say there's a teaching agenda around that point.
He says planning schools, including UBC's School of Community and Regional Planning, have overall become less theoretical and value-based. For example, UBC no longer has the thesis as principal assignment for master's students in their planning program.
I just wonder a little bit about whether, a professional planning program, does kind of push a market orientation, the market realities, in a way that the old social science and pure science-based instruction kind of challenged that paradigm.
According to Tom, planning programs have become less critical and social science-based and more pragmatic and market-oriented. So when City Manager Sidhu Johnston advises council in favor of pro-private developer solutions to the city's housing crisis, that's an example of him being part of a larger technocratic culture of city planning, rather than being biased towards any particular party or political ideology.
I mean, I would say that the professional staff, their loyalty, or they tend to take their mindset from other professionals like them.
That's Francis again.
Like, in a way, they're closer to other planners in other cities than they are necessarily to the politicians in their own city. Like, they go to school, they go to professional conferences, they read magazine articles that all espouse a particular idea of how you plan a city to live in. And that's where they tend to take their values from.
To put simply, the homogenous culture of city planning teaches planners to work within neoliberalism. And Tom says that in Vancouver, this link between city planning and free market capitalism has gotten stronger over the last decade.
When I was with the city, I think it was a pretty good balance. There were really strong people in the city manager's office, the director of planning, Ray Spax, and the director of finance, Peter Leckie, the city engineer, Bill Curtis. They were all strong personalities in their own right. And I worked for Mike Harcourt for 5 years and Gordon Campbell for 4 years. And although they're certainly very different cats, to say the least, each of them recognized that they did not exercise unlimited power and agency, that they needed to develop coalitions on council, see staff as partners and respected partners in developing a better city for everybody. They recognize that the city is more than a marketplace. It's more than a place to do business. It's a place where we're trying to develop a social identity and equity.
Tom thinks when Vision Vancouver came to power in 2008, that's when City Council really started to put more power in their own hands.
Like Vision, they kind of took it upon themselves over their 10 years in office to kind of reassert the power of the politicians, the councillors, and the mayor, to kind of run over a bit roughshod over communities in the interest of what they would see as the densification requirements of sustainability.
And it wasn't only communities. Tom says under Vision, council also took power away from staff.
As they got longer into their tenure, they were in power for about 10 years. I think a lot of them felt that, staff are perhaps kind of in the way of developing the kinds of densities, more market-oriented economy, attracting more investment income from wherever. And the planners, I think, found it more and more difficult to kind of counteract those forces.
So under Vision, from 2008 to 2018, the city's culture of market-oriented planning intensified. City planners, who in the past few decades had already become more pragmatic from their professional training, grew further accustomed to City Hall's urbanism, which relies heavily on private developers to build housing through incentive programs like Rental 100.
To talk in earlier eras about, planners as representing the interests of the poor, the weak, the disorganized. People talked about insurgency planners as people in the community who worked with residents and workers' groups against the power of the state or power of the markets and the corporate sector.
When Tom first got into planning in the 70s, city planners had a different reputation than they do today.
So I think when I started a long time ago, the assumption was that planners in the community were kind of there to protect the interests of the community and residents and workers.
The heroic days of city staff protecting citizens from corrupt city councils are a relic of a time before our current weak mayor, strong city manager system that Francis mentioned. And so today, in 2019, with our powerful city manager, Tom wonders whether the effect of Vision's decade-long majority has changed the way staff work with council.
I'm not a political scientist, I'm an urban geographer, but I'm just wondering, if there has been a kind of a transition in the city manager's job from somebody who was the head staff person who was responsible for kind of orchestrating and making coherent the different staff positions as advice to council on the one hand, to what seems now, and again, the last city manager as well, I can't remember his name offhand, sort of giving kind of small p political advice to council, which argues both for a change in the role of council as a decision-making body, but also the role of the city manager in going from kind of the senior staff person to coordinate and orchestrate staff opinion and professional views to kind of advising council where they should be going, perhaps, in policy areas. This is quite a new direction, as far as I'm concerned.
It seems like, in response to Vision Vancouver and their domination of council, which according to Tom diminished city staff and community agency, the city manager has now become more overtly political in guiding council decision-making. So you're saying that now the city manager, Sadhu Johnson, seems to be taking on more of a role of giving small p political advice.
I may even be large p political advice role. I don't know him very well, but they're hired by council, so I mean they are officially the creature of council. With they don't have 100% autonomy, but the way it's being structured in the last few years, certainly the last part of the Vision Council, was they're almost operating like another political persona with their own kind of value judgments and views, which they use to kind of shape some of the ideas of council about where the direction should be going. So there'll be, I'm sure, political scientists you could talk to about whether or not they see this the same thing that some of us are.
City staff, are they biased? This is what we know. City planners in Vancouver have increasingly learned to work within today's market realities, which, when it comes to housing, means we must rely on private developers to build homes. And over the last decade at City Hall, senior staff and planners have had to work under an especially domineering and neoliberal council, and as a result, staff likely adopted some of this council's approach to running the city. Beyond that, Tom Hutton thinks the city manager, Sadhu Johnston, has taken a more active role in not just orchestrating staff input, but actually offering political direction to council. Depending on whether or not you agree, an argument for bias could certainly be made here. Overall, though, what we see is a slow morphing of our political landscape, a gradual change or ebb and flow in how bureaucrats and planners are trained and how they operate within larger economic and political conditions. I'm Alex DeBoer. Thank you for listening.
There is a certain amount of tension between politicians and staff all the time. And in what I've seen, it's really productive city halls. The politicians and staff actually feel very aligned.
Special thanks to Francis Beulah, Tom Hutton, and Gordon Price.
And then at other times, you really see politicians who believe staff somehow are not carrying out what they want, and there's a lot of tension between them.
Music by Lee Rosevere and Xylo Zico. Right. And but this tension is typically heightened when a new council comes in.
Yeah.
Particularly
a new council that's trying to do things really differently from the past.
We are so happy because Fund Drive 2019 is officially over. What a great feeling. To everyone who donated their time, their energy, and their money, the people who forgot to donate now but will online at citr.ca/donate, those who couldn't donate this year but will next year, and to our community as a whole. CITR and Discorder just want to say...
Do you want to watch films from all around the world as well as from local filmmakers, make animations, and explore virtual worlds? Well, check out the Reel to Reel Film Festival for Youth, April 7th to 13th at the Vacancy Theater and the Roundhouse. There's activities for the whole family, including Sunday Fun Day and a pancake breakfast. You can find more info at r2rfestival.org or facebook.com/r2r festival.
Here's a little song I wrote. You might want to sing it note for note. Don't worry.
You're listening to CITR 101.9, broadcasting from UBC's Point Grey campus, located on the traditional, unceded Coast Salish territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people.
All right. And we're back. This is CITR 101.9 FM. You're listening to Democracy Watch. You just heard an audio documentary that I made. My name is Alex DeBoer, on the relationship between Vancouver city councillors and city staff, particularly the city manager. So I hope you enjoyed that piece. If you missed it, it's on our podcast Seeking Office, which you can download on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Up next on the show, we have a piece produced by News Collective member Guillermo Rosales. Guy made this piece from a policy perspective. He is a public policy student at the University of British Columbia at SCARP. And so in this piece, he and a classmate discuss the history of vacancy control in British Columbia, which we've been doing some research and reporting on here at the News Collective, and will hopefully be coming up with a more dense kind of documentary sometime in the near future. But right now, this is kind of more of a conversation about the history of vacancy control, what it is, when it was in place in BC, and sort of how it functions as a form of rent control. So let's go to that piece now, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Hello, my name is Guillermo Rosales.
And my name is Josh Taffel.
And we are both students in the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs program. Today we're going to be talking about a contentious issue, rent control, and essentially the Vancouver housing issue of affordable housing. Today we're going to look at the history of rent control, and specifically we're going to hone in on vacancy control as a mechanism or a policy option that Vancouver should be considering today. But it's important to ground ourselves in a historical context to understand all the nuances of this issue. And before we get to that, we're going to start with some definitions. So, Josh, what is rent control?
Right. Thank you, Guillermo. So, rent control is basically policy that how it works in Vancouver is that they put a limit on percent increase. Rent can go up each year. So, we have had policies in place since the 60s that limit rent increases per tenant to once a year. Rent control has been instituted to limit the amount they can increase it per year.
Right. And then vacancy vacancy control.
Right. So vacancy control is a little bit different. So rental control, as it is right now, it basically, it has an increase per the tenant that is there.
Yeah, it's percentages. It can be in the form of taxes. It's trying to regulate the rental market and maybe a little more broadly the housing market.
Yeah. So vacancy control would essentially tie those increases to the unit rather than to the contract with
the person.
Right.
Because as it stands, if I'm a landlord and I don't like my tenants, what I can do, if they're, I'm charging them $800 a month, but I realize I could be charging them $1,500 a month based on current market prices, then what I could do is I could claim at the end of their lease that I'm going to renovate, and then that after the renovation, they're going to have to leave because either I'm bringing in my family or my friends, or alternatively, I'm just demolishing my entire place and building something new. So these are tactics landlords have used and still try to use. We've seen it before. Not all landlords, of course, but some, in order to price gouge and make as much as they can on their investment.
Right.
So
it's something that current Vancouver councillor Jean Swanson has referred to as renovicting.
Yes, that's right. Renovicting.
Evicting for the purpose of renovations, or renovating for the purpose of eviction.
Yeah, and vacancy control would stop that because it would say, well, you can go ahead and renovate, but you can't charge an exorbitant amount to the next tenant. It has to be pretty much the same. But there's stipulations that we'll get into because this policy isn't so simple. It can be modified, as we'll see. So now that we kind of got an idea of what rent control is, we know that Vancouver is facing an affordability crisis in terms of housing, and it's really important to make that distinction because you will hear that Vancouver is facing a housing crisis, which is true, but specifically it's an affordability crisis. And we will get to that point a little later when we talk about the supply and demand of actual units in Vancouver. So let's start with the history. You mentioned the 1960s. I think it was the 1970s that rent control was really instituted in BC, specifically Vancouver.
Yeah. So I was referring to in the 60s, they brought in the policy where you could only increase the rent once per year.
Okay.
There was no limit on what that increase could be
Right.
until, as you're saying, in the 70s.
Right. BC's seen rent control since the 1970s. But let's go a little further back. And rent control in Canada has actually been around much longer. It's been around since the World Wars. This was done obviously in interim war efforts and post-war efforts to provide people stability coming out of the war. It was rocky economic times. Though the major deregulation moment occurred when the federal government transferred rent control over to provinces soon after World War II. That's when we saw a major kind of shift in regulation, and a lot of provinces didn't really do anything with that power. They just left the market the way it is, with the exception, of course, Quebec and Newfoundland. So fast forward to the 1970s in BC. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of tumultuous moments. There was the creation of the Vancouver Tenants Council. So what's interesting, I think, is in the 70s, we really are starting to see tenants organizing and pushing for mobilizing for rent control. But I guess I want to ask, what circumstances, led to this? What were the issues that would eventually lead to vacancy control? Well, as we know, in the 70s, vacancy rate was low. Vacancy rate was around 1% in the 70s, and at the end of the 70s, it was 0.2%. So it dropped throughout the 70s. Housing prices were increasing. There were instances of landlords trying to increase prices by sometimes 28, 30% without notice. So Vancouver Tenant Council was established in 1968. The same conditions were fueling renters to organize back then as they were now. Back then, there was no notice given for rent increases. So the first push of the Vancouver Tenant Council in the late 60s was for this notice to go through. So they protested and got the support of Harry Rankin, a city councillor at the time, in 1968. Eventually, a settlement was reached with landlords in a struggle that culminated in giving tenants 3 months' notice before rental increases. And there could only be one increase per year. So that was like the tail end of the 60s, what you mentioned there.
Yeah, 68 or 69.
Yeah.
So.
And then come the 1970s.
Yes. So, 1970s come. We have a period of high inflation. NDP government comes in, and they decide to introduce rent control.
And what kind of led to this, because they came into power in 1973, was in 1971, there was a 5-month strike led by tenants withholding rent because they had been hit with a 10% rent increase. The final settlement saw in the one building in Vancouver, one apartment building, 25 tenants evicted of the 264 that withheld rent, but no rent increase was permitted in the interim 5-month period.
People were boycotting them.
They were
just
boycotting
their rents.
They kind of won this battle, but a lot of people also left, probably as part of a boycott to this. Then comes the NDP government. Their platform was that they were going to give tenants bargaining rights, but they reneged on this. An instance in 1973 of more conflict was the Block Brothers, developers, instituted a 25% increase for their buildings. Tenants organized. The city council passed a resolution that rent increase should be limited to current inflation, which at the time was 9.2%. So the economic conditions of the 70s was somewhat different, right? There was less regulation around inflation and probably fiscal monetary policy.
Yeah, it was definitely not as well understood today as today, rather.
Definitely. A lot of policy was enacted without evidence-based decision-making. A lot of it was kind of done more intuitively. So then the NDP passed the Landlord and Tenant Act with some regressive features. So one of those was the
73.
Yeah, 73, 74.
Right.
And what they created a rentalsman who was essentially a person who would see rent increase percentages, based on case by case, and you could dispute it to them, but generally he was viewed by tenants as on the side of the landlords.
Right. They were not happy with it.
Exactly. But one progressive feature was that landlords needed to show just cause for evictions.
Yes. And I think in that article that you're referring to,
the
that was kind of, that was the big kind of success of that.
And when you think about it, that's a huge success in the 70s for people who are fighting for rent control and beginning to get some, because before this, you could be evicted for anything.
Right.
People could jack up rent without anything. And it's kind of crazy to think if you're living in, the mid to late 60s that I could be evicted for any reason and my rent could go up 30, 50% for any reason at any time without notice. So I think it makes sense given this historical context of an economy running rampant in terms of inflation and a low vacancy rate that people are getting angry and they're going to organize and fight for some sense of rights.
Absolutely.
So obviously this culminated in another conflict where landlords pressured the rentalsmen to increase rent to 28%. Tenants organized, took their case to city council, and for 1975, the rental increases were limited to 10.6%.
Right.
This led to the establishment of the Rent Review Commission, who authored a report that was largely ignored by city council. In this time, new construction was, interestingly enough, exempt from rent control. So this was the beginning of decontrol, where the NDP, was at the end of their power in the late 70s, 1976, 77, and the Social Credit Party was gaining power.
Yeah.
So now we're going to kind of go in a bit more here to talk about the various acts that occurred. So in 74, we saw the NDP pass the Interim Act. It was an interim act between the old Landlord and Tenants Act to the new, which is still our current Residential Tenancy Act. In this kind of act period between the early 70s or the late 70s, in 1973, we saw an amendment to the former act, and this amendment led to vacancy control. So it said, percentage increases were not tied from person to person, but they were tied to the unit. So Vancouver has had vacancy control before, and it's really important to note this. From 1973 to 83, it was instituted, but around 77, 78, when the new Residential Tenancy Act came in, we saw some deregulation and decontrol features coming into play. One of the biggest features was that new construction, as I've mentioned, was exempt from rent control. And on top of that, the next big real kicker to make sure vacancy control would go by the wayside was this idea that vacancy control would only apply to 1 to 2 bedroom apartments. Anything beyond that, if it was a multi-bedroom house, would be outside of rent control. So in the beginning of the 70s, we're seeing the NDP, the Social Credit Party supporting these rent control measures, and then at the end of the 70s and 80s, we're seeing decontrol.
And it's interesting because the Social Credit Party was elected in 1975?
76, towards the end of 76.
Right, right. So, and it was actually in their platform. There in the article, there was a picture of an ad they took out in the local newspaper that said, "We will not take away rent control."
And then, of course, they get into power and they help provide legislation that leads to decontrol.
Exactly.
Massive deregulation.
Over the course of about 5 or 6 years, it slowly kind of went away.
It was interesting to see, I think, that the Social Credit Party's narrative was no rent control, neoclassical theories of economics. Deregulate is better for the rental market. And then they switch back in terms of positions. Whereas the NDP was very consistent, but they faced pressure and caved a lot of the time to make sure businessmen and business people and investors were not feeling excluded. But I don't know, maybe you can give us some idea of what these economist theories are. Like what's really driving the opposition side to rent control?
Right. So the main sort of opposition is, I think the best argument they have is that it leads to less development.
Yeah.
So it basically inhibits supply. It says neoclassical economics, supply and demand, the free market meet at the equilibrium.
Yeah.
that's the best sort of price according to economists. So they would argue that you're actually limiting the supply of housing and you're actually making it harder for people to find housing.
Right.
So that would lead to a very low vacancy rate according to that side of the argument.
I think it's interesting also to mention that in one of the papers we read from the 1990s, Lazarin did her thesis on the rent control and deregulation and rent control in the 70s, the time period we're talking about, was that there was this constant rhetoric on the side of opponents to really solidify that no competent economist would advocate for rent control. They kept saying, without real tangible proof, that rent control would be, the death knell for developers. It would be terrible for people in the long run because you wouldn't be able to get a house. Rent would increase. But if we deregulated, then the market would take care of itself. So,
and there is some evidence that when you institute vacancy control and rent control, that does lead to less development.
Yes.
There was a study of 4 cities in California.
Yes.
Vacancy control they were talking about. But it does lead, it makes it more expensive for landlords and for developers. So it makes sense that they would invest less into development.
Yeah. So let's get into this now that we've got a better historical understanding of the 70s being a tumultuous time, conditions leading up to vacancy control, and really the conditions that led out of it was, the swing back in the political spectrum, the push that, the opponents won. They got into power and they set the stage for incremental deregulation into the 80s that led to complete deregulation. And as the findings of Lazarin points to, that in the 80s, what was already, a deteriorating market just got intensified and worse after deregulation. And her ultimate conclusion was that it was really hard to discern whether rent control actually affected anything in terms of the market. She said there's no clear link between rent control affecting economic conditions. What did affect economic conditions was level of GDP, inflation, interest rates, and of course, flows of migrants, inland migrants coming from, different parts of BC and leaving Vancouver. Now, in this kind of effort to further understand positions, we're going to now just quickly listen to the Vancouver Tenants Union and one of their representatives and what they think about vacancy control. So I'm here with Will Gladman, a representative from the Vancouver Tenants Union. Will, how are you today?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Just starting to feel the hay fever, unfortunately.
Oh, it's that time of year. So I was curious, what is the Vancouver Tenants Union views on vacancy control as a policy option for Vancouver?
So we're very firmly behind vacancy control as a policy option for Vancouver, as one that protects the people who are most at risk in this housing crisis that we're experiencing at the moment. The housing crisis is bad for everyone, whether you're an owner or a renter and at whatever income level. But we're finding that the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable people at the moment are low and fixed income renters. And these renters are facing really twin crises of affordability and displacement. And vacancy control we see as an option to combat both of those problems.
Yeah, do you think from the developers' side of this story, they claim that vacancy control would be the death knell to development? But recently I was looking at an article that was claiming essentially that the supply side of housing that's needed in Vancouver is actually a myth. We have more than enough supply to house people. The problem is affordability. So in terms of what developers are saying, what are your thoughts on kind of their position and why they're against vacancy control?
Yeah, the thing we have to remember about landlords and developers is that fundamentally they're profit-seeking enterprises, and their primary motive is to make a profit for themselves. So it's not very surprising that they're coming out against measures to increase affordability for tenants. I think supply is an important part of the equation, but what we should be talking about is affordable supply, and that's not what landlords and developers are promising. They want to keep building more market rate supply, which, as we're seeing increasingly, really isn't meeting the needs for low-income and fixed-income tenants.
Okay, thank you, Will. That was very educational. Okay, so you heard it. They are supportive of it because obviously their position is to protect tenants' rights and build upon them. Now, let's kind of talk about this idea. So this study was done in California by Professor Heskin and Garrett, and they studied 4 cities that had vacancy control. Do you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so I can bring up the findings here. So essentially they did a study of these 4 cities in California. Fortunately, I can't remember which cities they were.
I think one of them was Berkeley.
Okay.
Which was noticeable. And then there's a few other kind of smaller cities.
Right. So they compared them to other areas, I think in California, and they found that vacancy control led to lower rents. That makes sense. Longer tenure by tenants also makes sense. but also fewer new rental units created in these areas than in the comparison areas. And there was also, interestingly, a conversion of a portion of the housing stock from rent to ownership.
So ownership increased in these cities.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's correct.
I think what's really interesting is, once again, that study found that there was no clear link between rent control and housing market fluctuations. So once again, the rhetoric of the opponents is just that. It's just words. They're not presenting real, hard, empirical evidence. But something that's interesting, I think, in this study and a few of the other studies we've looked at is that more empirical analysis is needed to really determine what's going on, because I think this study mentioned that the data locally and contextually can actually support almost any side, which shows to the complexity of the issue. Something else that was interesting that was noted, I think, about these authors was that they said, yet in regulation, in rent control, what they tended to notice was that it took the edge off prices of homes, but it also secured that the housing market would not bottom out or crash. So it's almost like all this evidence is suggesting that in regulation, we're seeing a more managed kind of market where, you don't get the big highs, but you also don't get the big lows. You get something in between that's a little more equitable, but still potentially, I think, if done correctly and with some economic incentives, still profitable for people. But obviously, I think it's a very complex issue.
It is complex, and yeah, I mean, like you said, there's numbers, data you could use for both sides. So
yeah. Other interesting points in the study was that homes did not fall into a state of disrepair, as the opponents suggested. Rent control means homes will fall into a state of disrepair. Landlords less frequently renovated, so I think this pushed kind of the incentive of landlords to really only renovate when they needed to, as opposed to when they wanted to.
That's interesting.
I know. The prices of homes were not affected, the land value in the long run, but obviously, as I mentioned, it took the edge off home prices.
Right.
So I think it's reasonable to think if vacancy control as a policy option does go through, or is considered seriously in Vancouver, those are considerations to have, to maybe think a little more long-term as opposed to short-term. So I think now it would be nice to kind of maybe get into the opponent's kind of side of things. So we got some information from the Urban Developer Institute and along with the Fraser Institute. Josh, would you like to kind of give us more of the, I guess, underlying thoughts or even perspective of the economist and kind of the opposition? Because they really want to rely on the economic kind of theories and analysis for this issue.
Sure. So there's economic arguments on both sides, I think. In terms of the opponents, like I've mentioned, the main argument is that it decreases rental construction. So the argument is essentially that looking at vacancy control, they're not going to be able to charge the prices that they want to charge. So therefore, it's not going to be profitable for them, developers to develop new homes, new apartments. And that's the kind of argument that we've seen from the Urban Development Institute. In their survey, they mentioned this number, 12,000 new units
are under threat. Yeah.
Right.
And
so that's,
I was going to say, they also point to the vacancy rate, right? That's the issue, because the vacancy rate is, they're saying like 1% or less.
Right. That's right. So that's the other argument, is that there's people who want to live in these places, but since they're not being built, because they're theory not profitable for the developers, then supply is not meeting demand.
So I want to pause here, because I think this is like their main argument. Supply is not meeting demand.
Right.
But I think in this, in this research, I was asking myself, but what are they, like, what kind of supply? Like luxury supply? Affordable supply? Because currently the vacancy rate is less than 1% of Vancouver. But this doesn't really tell us, are all the homes being lived in? Or is this merely calculation done by who, like full ownership of places? Because it's clear that I think that most of the places in Vancouver are completely bought up. But like the bigger question is how many of them are just sitting empty or in some pseudo fashion of empty. I think one statistic from the Vancouver Sun or Vancouver Courier mentioned that 1 in 10 homes sit empty. So if that's the case, then our actual, like the real versus the nominal rate of vacancy would be 10%. The real vacancy rate would be 10%. But the nominal, just what we're going by in terms of land ownership or home ownership, it's 1%. So I think that's really important to note.
That is interesting to note.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of have an understanding of where we've been, where we're coming from and going, and now we're here in a situation where we have multiple taxes instituted, such as the foreign buyers tax.
Right.
That's 15%.
Yeah.
Such as the speculation tax, which varies depending on registering and whether you're a Canadian citizen. Empty homes tax, which is 1% of your property.
Right. And these are interesting because I think these are trying to get at that problem that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Of how, the real vacancy rate is quite high. And a lot of people do think it's because people use the Vancouver housing market basically as speculation. So
then it's interesting that, the opponents are saying there's not enough supply to meet the demand when actually we look at the Vancouver fact sheet for housing. There's about 66,000 dwellings that are currently in oversupply. So technically in Vancouver, we're actually at a surplus for housing units.
Right.
And one professor, Dr. John Rose, who's creating a working paper on debunking the myth of the housing supply in Vancouver, suggests that this is a myth. We have more than enough supply to last us for the next 5 years or so.
Right.
We don't have to keep building exponentially. So this leads me to think that, if we created vacancy control and developers say, we're going to have to move to another city, I think that's fine because we have enough houses. The issue is affordability.
The issue is let's break this apart a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it seems like if we have a whole bunch of vacant homes, then maybe there's a problem with the incentive to actually rent out that home.
Yeah. You don't think the problem is that the price is too high?
I mean, if you think about it, if the price is too high, they're charging too much for rent, and therefore nobody is coming to rent the house. The logical step would be to lower the rent.
Yeah.
So that they have somebody to rent it out. So I'm wondering, that seems like a complicated issue. And maybe there's barriers to renting that.
Yeah. And I think this is where the, foreign investment, the money laundering that's being investigated initially by David Eby and now by a different commission.
Right.
This is kind of where this begins to play in, right?
Absolutely.
But it's not the driving factor. But that's kind of, I think, how that ties in, like this perception that a lot of the problem is based on the other, this community.
Foreigners.
Right. And that's a factor, but it's not the whole picture. And I think that's what's really important to establish here, that really it's everyone jumping on the bandwagon. Really it's all the landowners and land developers jumping on the bandwagon, like in a stock market where you see this speculative frenzy, the stocks going up, everyone's buying in, and then of course, like most stock markets with penny stocks or speculative stocks, things come crashing down at everyone panics, sells off, and the smart ones wait until it gets low and then buy in again.
Right.
But I think that's kind of what we're seeing here more than anything. So if anyone is going to get upset at anyone, it should be at, let's face it, the developers and the landlords, not all of them, but, the ones that are really just price gouging people. Yeah. So any other thoughts, Josh? This is a complex issue. I'm sure we'll discover more and more as we keep researching.
Certainly a complex issue. Just these past few days doing more research on the issue, it's been fascinating to me. It's something very local.
Yeah.
Affects a lot of people. A lot of people have been talking about it. It's always in the news. One of the biggest issues in municipal politics and provincial British Columbia politics. So it's
I think
there's information out there. There needs to be more. But
one important thing to note is also that currently in Vancouver, all these taxes have cooled our real estate market. We've seen roughly a double-digit 10% drop in housing prices across Vancouver, but the biggest thing to note here is that rental prices have stayed the same. So I guess we'll just end there. Thanks for being on the show. And please listen to us for more policy talks and options and issues at www.pubpoly.com for more thrilling policy talks from the MPPGA students. Thank you.
Yeah.
UBC Women in Science Club provides support for female undergraduates in science fields. Our club has 3 pillars: mentorship, building community, and connecting people. We offer networking events with alumni, professional development workshops, as well as an ongoing mentorship program to support students through challenges that arise for women pursuing careers in science.
To understand more about fashion, we asked CITR student executive and fashion expert Jonathan Q what fashion means to him.
It's just aesthetically something that's so ostentatious. Typically. I mean, because of course, it's also, when you say fashion, I think people are talking explicitly about consumerism, as opposed to someone who buys let's say someone buys a
If you really want to know more about fashion, come on down to CITR in the Student Union building of UBC and pick up some of our merchandise à la mode. Nous avons t-shirts,
sweatshirts, socks, and coffee mugs.
But it's also very aesthetically gripping.
To keep you styling in support of the station you love. Isn't that right, Jonathan?
Well, actually, is it? Because, I mean, I was going to say because of the cultural vacuum that we exist within, but then, really, fashion today is kind of derived from the European idea of couture, and that's been around for centuries.
All right, and you're listening to CITR 101.9 FM. This is Democracy Watch. So on today's show, we're just wrapping things up. We heard a documentary on the relationship between city staff and city councilors, which has power or how they share power, one as an elected body of representatives and the other as a group of bureaucrats who are hired to help implement policy and help city councilors do their job, essentially. And then we also heard a discussion on vacancy control and the history of sort of rent control in BC in terms of mid-20th century, not the whole history, with News Collective member Guillermo Rosales, and that was told from a policy perspective. We'll have more stories coming up in the next few weeks on vacancy control. We want to look into the reasons why we had it and why we lost it, and how conditions compare to today, because there is a big fight among many housing advocates to get vacancy control again. So stay tuned for more of our reporting on that. Up next, we have No Dead Air, so stay tuned for that. And for more local news coverage of Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, tune in again next Thursday at 5 p.m. on CITR 101.9 FM. And do check out our municipal politics podcast, Seeking Office. So, as I said, up next is No Dead Air. Thanks so much for listening today. Take care.